April 17, 1989. A peculiar album hits record stores across Britain and America. The cover features surreal, disturbing images: a monkey with a halo, a pelvic bone with a stiletto, hair on a spoon laid across a woman's torso. The band's name sounds like a children's fairy tale. Pixies. Inside those grooves is 38 minutes of music that will rewrite the rules of rock and roll. The album enters the UK charts at number 8. In America, it barely cracks the Billboard 200 at number 171. Critics are divided. Some call it a commercial sellout. Others recognize it immediately as a masterpiece. 5 years later, a heroin-addicted Seattle musician will admit to Rolling Stone magazine, "I was trying to write the ultimate pop song. I was basically trying to rip off the Pixies. That song, Smells Like Teen Spirit, will sell 10 million copies and define a generation." The Pixies album that inspired it will take 30 years to reach platinum. This is the story of how four mismatched Bostonians, a surrealist-obsessed frontman, a charismatic bassist he couldn't stand, a Filipino guitarist who thought he had no future, and a drummer who wanted to be a magician, created an album that changed everything while nearly destroying themselves in the process. Welcome to the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. This is Doolittle. To understand Doolittle, you first need to understand what the Pixies were running from. March 1988. The band's debut album, Surfer Rosa, explodes across Britain like a sonic grenade. Produced by Steve Albini, the uncompromising engineer who would later work with Nirvana on In Utero, the album is raw, abrasive, confrontational. It sounds like it was recorded in a basement filled with broken glass and religious pamphlets. British music magazines lose their minds. Melody Maker and Sounds both name Surfer Rosa their album of the year. The Pixies become overnight heroes in the UK, where the indie rock scene embraces their strange mixture of biblical violence, Spanish lyrics, and guitars that sound like chainsaws cutting through velvet. America barely notices. The band, Black Francis, born Charles Thompson, guitarist Joey Santiago, bassist Kim Deal, and drummer David Lovering, had recorded Surfer Rosa in just 10 days at Boston's Q Division Studios for $10,000. Albini took a flat fee of $1,500 and refused royalties on principle. The recording philosophy was simple: capture the band live, no overdubs, no polish, no compromise. Santiago recalls the sessions. "We met Steve Albini at a coffee shop and that was it. We were in the next day. We were ready. We were very ready." But Surfer Rosa created an unexpected problem. The album was too raw for American radio, too abrasive for mainstream success, and within the band, tensions were beginning to simmer. The flashpoint was a song called Gigantic, the only track on Surfer Rosa that Kim Deal co-wrote and sang lead vocals on. When journalists asked Black Francis why Deal didn't sing more, he would literally get up and leave the table. Deal remembered the dynamic. When reporters asked, "Why doesn't Kim sing more?" he would get up from the table. He was very bad. Obviously, that became a button that the press pressed over and over again. Francis admitted his ego was bruised. "I have an ego. You have to have an ego to do this." At that time we were playing and I said to myself, "I'm doing all the work. She is smoking a cigarette and the public adores her. Why am I leaving my skin writing all these damn songs?" The chemistry that made the Pixies special, Francis's surrealist intensity versus Deal's effortless cool, was also tearing them apart. By summer 1988, the band knew they needed to make their next album different. The question was, how different? 4AD label head Ivo Watts Russell had a plan. Instead of the confrontational Albini, he suggested Gil Norton, a Liverpool-born producer who had worked with Echo and the Bunnymen and Throwing Muses. The band had actually worked with Norton before, on a remixed single version of Gigantic in May 1988. Francis had no strong preference for a producer, so Watts Russell made the choice. Norton was Albini's opposite in every way. Where Albini was ideologically pure and aesthetically confrontational, Norton was diplomatic, commercial-minded, and obsessed with sonic clarity. Where Albini refused to call himself a producer, Norton embraced the role completely. David Lovering describes what he learned from Norton. "One of the first things I learned from working with Gil was I had to learn how to use a click, playing along to a click tempo. And at first it was very daunting. It was tough. But Norton brought something else crucial to the Pixies: tact." Lovering continues, "What a producer mostly also has is the gift of tact, and being an ambassador in running the ship in the social setting. And Gil is wonderful at it. That's why he's part of the family. The Pixies call him that." Norton arrived in Boston in mid-October 1988 to meet with Francis and review the demo recordings. They spent 2 days analyzing song structures and arrangements, then 2 full weeks in pre-production as Norton familiarized himself with the Pixies' sound. This was revolutionary for the band. Santiago remembers. The first time I'd heard of pre-production was working with Gil Norton on Doolittle. We met Steve Albini at a coffee shop and that was it. We were in the next day. 4AD gave the Pixies a budget of $40,000, 4 times what they'd spent on Surfer Rosa. It was still modest by major label standards, but it represented a massive leap in ambition. The creative vision was clear but contradictory. Francis later told Rolling Stone, "This record is him trying to make us, shall I say, commercial, and us trying to remain somewhat grungy." The battle lines were drawn between artistic purity and mainstream success. The album that would emerge from that tension would somehow achieve both. October 31st, 1988. Halloween. Recording sessions for Doolittle begin at Downtown Recorders in Boston, a 24-track studio. Francis brought a mixture of newly written and older tracks to the sessions. Many of the newer songs were underdeveloped. According to Norton, they were minute or minute-and-a-half ditties consisting of short bursts of verse, chorus, verse, beat, 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 bang, finished. Of the approximately 23 song ideas the band started with, only 15 would make the final album, and of those 15, only 3 would exceed 3 minutes in length. This brevity became a sticking point between Norton and Francis. The producer wanted longer, more developed songs. Francis wanted to keep things short and punchy. The dispute came to a head one day when Norton pushed Francis to extend several tracks. Francis's response was characteristically oblique. Santiago tells the story. Gil wanted a lot of the songs extended, but Charles played Gil the Box Tops hit, The Letter. That clocks in a little bit under 2 minutes, so that was our signpost. It doesn't have to be long, the songs don't have to be like that. You can get in and out of there and cut out all of the fat. Francis took Norton to a record store and played him a Buddy Holly record where most songs didn't cross the 2-minute barrier. Norton backed down on that particular battle. After the Boston sessions, the band moved to Carriage House Studios in Stamford, Connecticut for 3 weeks of recording beginning November 28th. The residential studio allowed Norton to work with 2 assistant recording engineers and 2 second assistants. He hired Stephen Hagler as mixing engineer, someone he'd worked with before at Fort Apache Studios. Norton's production approach was meticulous. He built tracks by suggesting the band double or repeat sections. During final mixing, Norton smoothed the band's rough edges using tight compression, adding reverb and delay to the guitars, which he tracked in multiple layers. This sonic polish is especially notable on Debaser, the album's intended lead single, and in the double-tracked vocals on Wave of Mutilation. But not everyone was happy with Norton's approach. Santiago became increasingly concerned about the amount of reverb being added to his guitar parts. In protest, Santiago covered his Marshall guitar amplifiers with blankets to make clear he did not want his sound to be interfered with. The gesture was passive-aggressive but effective. Santiago made his point without direct confrontation, a very Pixies way of handling conflict. Lovering had his own challenge. He recalls Norton suggesting he try different snare drums. During pre-production, it was wonderful that for the first time I had a lot of snares at my disposal. We were recording in Los Angeles and there was a guy called the Drum Doctor. I had 2 snares in my kit and I had 2 more come in to try. He continues, I went and got an Artstar 2, a power kit. And that was probably my favorite kit of all time. It sounded incredible. The opening track, Debaser, set the tone for everything that followed. Francis wrote the song after being inspired by the surrealist film Un Chien Andalou by Spanish director Luis Buñuel and Salvador Dalí. The infamous eye-slicing scene from the 1929 film influenced Francis's cryptic lyrics. Francis explained his approach. I am un chien Andalucia was his way of declaring allegiance to the surrealist rejection of rational narrative. The lyrics were deliberately nonsensical, more concerned with sound and feeling than literal meaning. Here Comes Your Man presented a different kind of challenge. Francis had actually written the song as a teenager. It was one of the oldest compositions in the Pixies catalog. Norton sped up the tempo, transforming what had been a country-tinged ballad into an up-tempo pop song. The band initially resisted. Santiago remembers, Here Comes Your Man came out very, very poppy, and we refused to play it. We never played it until the reunion. The song felt too commercial, too accessible for a band that prided itself on being difficult and confrontational. But Norton understood something the band didn't. Accessibility and artistry weren't mutually exclusive. Monkey Gone to Heaven became the album's most ambitious production. It was the only Pixies song to feature additional musicians, a string quartet consisting of Arthur Fiacco and Ann Rorich on cello, with Karen Karlsrud and Corinne Metter on violin. The song's lyrics reflected Francis's fascination with biblical numerology and environmental themes. He explained that in Hebrew numerology, man is marked as number 5, Satan as number 6, and God as number 7. These numbers also appear on the album cover. Francis's scream of "This monkey's gone to heaven" became one of the Pixies' most iconic moments, equal parts anguish, absurdity, and apocalyptic warning. Dead and Gouge Away both drew from Old Testament stories. Dead retold the story of David and Bathsheba, while Gouge Away referenced Samson and Delilah. Francis's Pentecostal upbringing, his parents had joined an evangelical church when he was 12, provided endless material for his surrealist reinterpretations of biblical violence. Wave of Mutilation took inspiration from something more contemporary and disturbing. Francis based the lyrics on newspaper reports of Japanese businessmen committing murder-suicide by driving off piers into the ocean after unsuccessful business ventures. The song's menacing surf rock groove made the subject matter even more unsettling, like a Beach Boys song written for the apocalypse. Silver stood out as the only track on the album co-written by Francis and Kim Deal. It was also the only song where the usual instrumental roles reversed. Lovering played bass while Deal played acoustic slide guitar. This moment of genuine collaboration between Francis and Deal would be one of the last. The dynamic that created Silver was already deteriorating. John Murphy, Deal's husband at the time, noticed the shift. The band dynamic went from just all fun to work during the production. What had been playful creative friction on Surfer Rosa was hardening into genuine animosity. Francis was asserting more control over the songwriting and production. Deal felt increasingly sidelined. Kurt Cobain, who would later become the Pixies' most famous fan, noticed this too. In 1992, he told an interviewer, "I wish Kim was allowed to write more songs for the Pixies because Gigantic is the best Pixies song and Kim wrote it." Deal responded modestly, "Well, it's better than somebody saying, 'Oh God, you suck.'" But Cobain's comment highlighted a fundamental tension. The Pixies' most commercially successful and emotionally resonant song wasn't written by their primary songwriter. That fact gnawed at Francis. The recording sessions dragged on. Production continued until December 12, 1988, as Norton and Hogler mixed the album and added effects. What had started as a 3-week project stretched into 6 weeks. The budget ballooned beyond the initial $40,000. The band's label, 4AD, absorbed the overages, betting that a more polished Pixies album would finally break through in America. Meanwhile, Steve Albini, the Pixies' previous producer, was watching from the sidelines with disgust. In a 1994 interview with Forced Exposure magazine, Albini unleashed a scathing assessment. "A patchwork pinch loaf from a band who at their top dollar best are blandly entertaining college rock. Their willingness to be guided by their manager, their record company, and their producers is unparalleled. Never have I seen 4 cows more anxious to be led around by their nose rings." Albini's contempt was palpable. He viewed Norton's production as a betrayal of everything that made Surfer Rosa great. Its rawness, its refusal to compromise, its anarchic spirit. Years later, Albini would walk back these comments, admitting he'd behaved like an ass and should have given the band more credit. But in 1989, his words stung. The Pixies found themselves in an impossible position, too weird for mainstream success, too polished for the underground purists. Photographer Simon Larbalestier and graphic artist Vaughn Oliver, who had designed the Pixies' previous albums, created the artwork for Doolittle. According to Larbalestier, this was the first album where they had access to lyrics, which made a fundamental difference. Oliver and Francis collaborated on creating macabre, surreal images to illustrate each song. The pairings were carefully chosen. A monkey with a halo for Monkey Gone to Heaven, complete with the numerological references 5, 6, and 7. A pelvic bone with a stiletto for Tame. Hair on a spoon laid across a woman's torso for Gouge Away. The images weren't literal illustrations. They captured the disturbing dreamlike quality of Francis's lyrics. The album's title went through several iterations. Francis's working title was Whore, but he eventually worried, people were going to think I was some kind of anti-Catholic. The final title, Doolittle, was characteristically oblique. It referenced Dr. Doolittle, the fictional character who could talk to animals, but it also suggested doing little, minimal effort, understatement. For an album that would influence an entire generation of rock musicians, the title was perfectly ironic. Doolittle was released in the UK on April 17, 1989, and in the US the following day. The commercial rollout was more sophisticated than anything the Pixies had experienced before. Elektra Records had signed the band in October 1988 following a bidding war, then negotiated with 4AD for US distribution rights. Polygram secured Canadian rights. Elektra gave the album major label treatment, retail displays across the US, key radio station promotion for the lead single Monkey Gone to Heaven, proper marketing budget. The results were mixed but promising. On the week of release, the album reached number 8 on the UK Albums Chart, the Pixies' highest chart position to date. But in America, it charted at number 171 on the Billboard 200. Monkey Gone to Heaven became the first single, released a month before the album. It reached number 5 on Billboard's Modern Rock Tracks chart. Here Comes Your Man, released in June 1989, hit number 3 on the Modern Rock chart and number 54 on the UK Singles chart. Critical response was largely positive, though not unanimously enthusiastic. Rolling Stone gave the album 3.5 stars initially. Decades later, they would re-review it and award it 5 stars. NME wrote, "Doolittle is consistently brilliant. Let's be honest, this is what music was made for." The Daily Telegraph called it a scintillating rock and roll album. But some critics felt Norton's production had neutered the band's raw power. The debate between Surfer Rosa purists and Doolittle advocates would rage for decades. Doolittle sold steadily in America, breaking 100,000 copies after 6 months. By early 1992, while the Pixies were supporting U2 on their Zoo TV tour, the album was selling 1,500 copies per week. The album was a slow burn success, exactly what underground classics are made of. If the recording of Doolittle had been tense, the tour that followed was catastrophic. The band embarked on a European tour to support the album. The shows were well attended and critically acclaimed. But backstage, Francis and Gil were barely speaking. The breaking point came during a concert in Stuttgart, Germany. Francis threw a guitar at Gil during the show. The next day, Gil refused to perform at the Frankfurt concert. She was nearly fired from the band. Francis later explained to Spin magazine that Gil had shown up an hour late to a sold-out show, and he'd kicked the guitar at her in frustration. But the incident revealed deeper problems. The creative tension that had made the Pixies interesting was curdling into genuine hostility. Santiago remembers the atmosphere. With Kim, it was the same deal. I don't know if she understood what I was about. I didn't understand what she was all about necessarily. But we shared the same passion of, isn't music cool? Isn't music amazing? That was enough to declare us. We're a band. But that passion wasn't enough anymore. Francis and Gil stopped traveling together on tour. They stopped socializing. The Cold War was on. By fall 1989, the band took a much-needed hiatus. Francis moved to Los Angeles and did a short solo tour to raise money for furniture. Lovering and Santiago went on vacation, and Kim Deal realized she needed her own creative outlet. During the Pixies hiatus, Deal formed the Breeders with Tanya Donnelly of Throwing Muses. Their debut album, Pod, was recorded in 1990 with, notably, Steve Albini producing. The Breeders allowed Deal to be a frontwoman, to write songs without Francis's shadow, to sing lead without asking permission. When the Pixies reconvened to record Bossa Nova in 1990, Deal arrived late to the sessions, finishing her Breeders' work first. Her input on Bossa Nova was minimal. From Bossa Nova onward, Francis wrote all the band's original material. This contributed to the increasing tension. The musical contrast between Francis and Deal, an essential ingredient of the Pixies' magic, was gone. Their 1991 album Trompe le Monde saw Deal's role diminished even further. Some critics called it Black Francis's first solo album. The Pixies opened for U2 on the massive Zoo TV tour in 1992. They were playing to 50,000 plus people per night. They should have been at their peak. Instead, the Cold War between Francis and Deal had frozen into permafrost. In early 1993, Francis announced in an interview with BBC Radio 5 that the Pixies were finished. He hadn't told the other band members. He later called Santiago and notified Deal and Lovering via fax. Francis offered no explanation. Years later, he admitted, "There was that animosity between Kim and me. It was like a Cold War. I mean, not aggressive, but definitely passive-aggressive. It was no longer fun." The Pixies were over. Doolittle would remain their commercial and critical peak, an album they could barely stand to tour, created by a band that couldn't stand each other. While the Pixies were imploding, a struggling Seattle band was about to change everything. Kurt Cobain had been obsessed with the Pixies since hearing Surfer Rosa in 1988. He considered Surfer Rosa his second favorite album of all time, ranking it above records by the Beatles, The Clash, and the Sex Pistols. Only Iggy and the Stooges' Raw Power ranked higher. But it was Doolittle that gave Cobain his template. In late 1990, Cobain was writing new songs for Nirvana's second album. One song in particular came together quickly, based on graffiti his friend Kathleen Hanna had written on his wall after a drunken night. "Kurt smells like teen spirit." Cobain later explained, I was trying to write the ultimate pop song. I was basically trying to rip off the Pixies. I have to admit it. When I heard the Pixies for the first time, I connected with that band so heavily that I should have been in that band, or at least a Pixies cover band. We used their sense of dynamics, being soft and quiet, and then loud and hard. The quiet, loud, quiet dynamic that defines Smells Like Teen Spirit comes directly from Doolittle tracks like Tame and Debaser. According to music writer Mark Beaumont, Tame and Gouge Away were among the Pixies tracks Kurt Cobain had in mind when writing Smells Like Teen Spirit. Even Nirvana bassist Krist Novoselic noticed. After writing Smells Like Teen Spirit, both Cobain and Novoselic thought, this really sounds like the Pixies. People are really going to nail us for this. They were right, and they didn't care. Smells Like Teen Spirit was released in September 1991. Within months, Nirvana's Nevermind had displaced Michael Jackson's Dangerous at the top of the Billboard 200. Alternative rock had conquered the mainstream. The Pixies had lit the fuse. Nirvana just happened to be standing there when it exploded. Black Francis acknowledged the influence philosophically. When asked about it years later, he said, "It certainly was very popular. It was catchy. At the end of the day, everyone is just a musician. We're all just working musicians. We all play different styles. That's who we are. We're just a bunch of music geeks." Joey Santiago was more direct. Nirvana is great because they carried the torch that we dropped. The Pixies broke up in 1993. Doolittle continued selling. By the middle of 1993, 2 years after Trompe le Monde, Doolittle was selling an average of 1,200 copies per week. A decade after the band's breakup, it was still moving 500 to 1,000 copies weekly. After their 2004 reunion tour, sales reached 1,200 copies per week again. The Recording Industry Association of America certified Doolittle Gold in 1995 and Platinum in 2018, recognizing 1 million units sold. But sales numbers tell only part of the story. Doolittle influenced virtually every major alternative rock band of the 1990s and 2000s. Radiohead, Smashing Pumpkins, Weezer, PJ Harvey, Modest Mouse, they all drew from the Pixies' blueprint. PJ Harvey told an interviewer she was in awe of I Bleed and Tame, describing Francis's writing as amazing. She immediately sought out Steve Albini to produce her own records. David Bowie declared, "The first time I heard Pixies was around 1988. I found it just about the most compelling music outside of Sonic Youth in the entire 80s. Tom York of Radiohead said that Radiohead following the Pixies at Coachella in 2004 would be like being supported by the Beatles. The album's influence extended beyond sound. The Pixies proved that weird, uncompromising art could coexist with catchy melodies. That songs about biblical violence and environmental catastrophe could be radio-friendly. That you didn't have to choose between being smart and being accessible. In 2004, NME readers voted Doolittle the second-best album of all time. Pitchfork ranked it number 4 in their Best Albums of the 80s poll. Rolling Stone's 5-star re-review concluded that the album laid the groundwork for 90s rock. In 2004, after a decade apart, the Pixies reunited. The 4 original members, Francis, Santiago, Deal, and Lovering, got back together for what was initially just a tour. The shows sold out instantly. Younger fans who'd been introduced to the band through Nirvana came in droves. In 2009, the band toured Doolittle in its entirety to celebrate the album's 20th anniversary. Santiago remembers, "The goal when you're in the studio is to record something that's going to last forever. And we happened to hit the mark." But the Francis-Deal tension remained unresolved. In 2013, Deal left the band again, this time of her own accord, to focus on the Breeders. Joey Santiago confirmed there was no dramatic falling out. "We said our goodbyes, and that's it. We really don't communicate with her. But there's no hard feelings on my end, and I'm sure there's no hard feelings on her end." The Pixies continued with bassist Paz Lenchantin, releasing new albums without Deal. Francis declared his solo career over, committing fully to the band. But the magic was gone. The creative tension that made Doolittle special, Francis's control-freak perfectionism versus Deal's effortless charisma, couldn't be recreated with session musicians. In 2014, 4AD released Doolittle 25, a deluxe 3-disc set featuring the original album, B-sides, Peel sessions, and complete demos. The Peel sessions had been recorded on October 18, 1988 and May 2, 1989, and originally broadcast on BBC Radio 1. The demos revealed how crucial Norton's production had been. Without his polish, the songs sounded thin, disjointed, incomplete. The ditties Francis brought to the studio really did need Norton's architectural vision to become classics. 35 years later, Doolittle sounds like it could have been recorded yesterday. The quiet, loud, quiet dynamic that seemed so revolutionary in 1989 is now the lingua franca of alternative rock. Every band from Foo Fighters to Jack White to St. Vincent has used it. The album's surrealist lyrics, once considered indecipherably weird, now seem prescient. Biblical violence, environmental catastrophe, the alienation of modern life. Francis was writing about 2024's anxieties in 1988. Doolittle sold over 1.45 million copies, making it the Pixies' best-selling album by far. But more importantly, it fundamentally changed what rock music could be. It proved that aggressive music could have melody, that pop songs could be intellectual, that you could scream about God and the devil and still get played on MTV. The cost was high. The Pixies essentially destroyed themselves making Doolittle and its aftermath. The Francis-Dio relationship never recovered. The band broke up before they could capitalize on grunge's success. By the time alternative rock conquered the mainstream in 1992, the Pixies were already splitting up. They were grunge's founding fathers, but they never got to rule the kingdom they'd built. Gil Norton, reflecting on the album decades later, admitted the production battles had been necessary. Looking back, I think the tension was productive. Charles wanted to keep it raw. I wanted to make it accessible. The album found the balance because neither of us completely won. Norton went on to become one of alternative rock's most sought-after producers, working with Foo Fighters, The Cranberries, and James, all bands influenced by the Pixies' sound. Steve Albini eventually made peace with his harsh 1994 comments. In a 2005 interview, he acknowledged, "I was being an asshole. The Pixies made great records. Doolittle is a great record. I was bitter because I wanted to work with them again, and they chose someone else. That was my problem, not theirs." Kim Deal has been characteristically gracious about the Francis dynamic. In a 2013 interview, she said, "We made some incredible music together. That's more than most people can say about their co-workers. I don't regret any of it." Francis, now performing again under his birth name Charles Thompson, has been more reflective. "I was young and controlling and probably impossible to work with. Kim brought something to the Pixies that I couldn't provide. This natural coolness, this effortless charisma. I should have appreciated that more." David Lovering, who now works as a magician between Pixies tours, offers perhaps the most philosophical take. "We were four people who shouldn't have been in a band together, but somehow, for a brief moment, we made magic. That's what Doolittle is. Four incompatible people creating something none of us could have made alone." Joey Santiago, still the quietest member, simply says, "We captured lightning in a bottle. You can't plan that. You can't replicate it. It just happens, and then it's gone." The story of Doolittle raises questions that remain unanswered. If Francis had given Deal more creative space, would the Pixies have lasted longer? Or would they have lost the tension that made their music electric? If they'd stayed with Steve Albini instead of moving to Gil Norton, would they have maintained underground credibility but missed mainstream influence? Or would they have remained cult favorites while someone else's band defined the 90s? If they'd broken through commercially in 1989 instead of breaking up in 1993, would we remember them as revolutionary pioneers or just another successful alternative rock band? The album's title, Doolittle, proved prophetic in ways Francis couldn't have intended. The band did little to promote their success. They did little to capitalize on grunge's explosion. They did little to resolve their internal conflicts. And yet, by doing little, they accomplished everything. Let's be clear about what Doolittle actually achieved. It reached number 8 in the UK, the Pixies' highest chart position ever. It produced 2 modern rock hits, Monkey Gone to Heaven and Here Comes Your Man. It was certified platinum in 2018, marking 1 million sales in the United States alone. It inspired Kurt Cobain to write Smells Like Teen Spirit, the song that sold 10 million copies and defined a generation. It influenced virtually every significant alternative rock band of the 1990s and 2000s, Radiohead, Smashing Pumpkins, Weezer, Modest Mouse, PJ Harvey, and dozens more. It proved that art and accessibility weren't mutually exclusive, that you could be weird and popular, surreal and catchy, uncompromising and successful. But the human cost was equally clear. The Francis-Dio relationship never recovered from the tensions of 1988-89. The band broke up in 1993, unable to sustain the creative friction that made them great. They missed the commercial peak of the alternative rock movement they'd helped create. Even their 2004 reunion, while commercially successful, couldn't recapture the lightning-in-a-bottle magic of the original lineup's chemistry. Both things are true. Both things matter. Doolittle didn't just influence bands. it changed how we think about rock music. Before Doolittle, the dominant modes in rock were either uncompromising underground punk, too abrasive for mainstream success, or polished pop rock, too commercial for critical respect. The album proved you could split the difference, that production values and artistic integrity could coexist. This philosophy would define alternative rock throughout the 1990s. Nirvana's Nevermind, produced by Butch Vig, took the same approach, raw emotion and punk energy, but with professional production that could compete on commercial radio. The Smashing Pumpkins' Siamese Dream, Radiohead's The Bends, Weezer's Blue Album, all these landmark 90s records owe a debt to Gil Norton's production philosophy on Doolittle. The album also changed how we think about song structure. Most of the songs on Doolittle clock in under 3 minutes, with only 3 tracks exceeding that length. Francis's insistence on brevity, inspired by Buddy Holly and the Box Tops, proved that modern rock songs didn't need extended guitar solos or lengthy instrumental sections to be meaningful. This economy of expression became a hallmark of alternative rock. The White Stripes, The Strokes, Arctic Monkeys, all these 2000s garage rock revival bands inherited the Pixies' preference for short, punchy songs over prog rock indulgence. Even the album's lyrical approach was revolutionary. Francis's surrealist biblical violence and environmental apocalypticism provided a template for how rock lyrics could be simultaneously meaningless and meaningful, impressionistic rather than literal, focused on sound and feeling over narrative clarity. Radiohead's Tom York, Modest Mouse's Isaac Brock, and countless other lyricists learned from Francis that you didn't need to make literal sense to make emotional sense. In 2019, BBC Radio 2 aired a documentary about Doolittle featuring interviews with Norton, Santiago, and Lovering. The engineer Stephen Haigler revealed technical details that had never been public. Haigler explained that Norton's use of tight compression and multiple guitar layers was considered cutting edge in 1988. Many of the sonic innovations on Doolittle, the way guitars suddenly explode from whispers to screams, the way Deal's bass cuts through the mix with surgical precision, required technical approaches that were then experimental. Norton admitted he sometimes worked on mixes while the band slept. There were nights I'd stay up until 4 a.m. getting a guitar sound perfect, knowing Charles would argue with me about it in the morning. But once he heard it, he usually came around. The documentary also revealed that the string quartet on Monkey Gone to Heaven was recorded in a single afternoon session, with Norton writing out the arrangements by hand just hours before. The rushed improvisational quality of the sessions, despite Norton's reputation for meticulous planning, suggests that much of what makes Doolittle special was accidental. The happy accidents that occur when talented people are under pressure and slightly at odds with each other. As the 2000s progressed and alternative rock became classic rock, Doolittle underwent critical reassessment. Rolling Stone, which had originally given the album 3.5 stars, re-reviewed it decades later and awarded it a perfect 5-star rating. The magazine's revised assessment called it the album that invented 90s rock. In 2003, NME's readers poll ranked Doolittle as the second-best album of all time, ahead of every Beatles album except Revolver. Pitchfork's 2004 ranking of the best albums of the 1980s placed Doolittle at number 4, behind only London Calling, Remain in Light, and The Queen is Dead. The Library of Congress hasn't yet inducted Doolittle into the National Recording Registry, unlike Lauryn Hill's The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill, but music historians increasingly argue it deserves recognition as a culturally significant American recording. The album's commercial longevity is equally impressive. 35 years after its release, Doolittle continues to sell approximately 501,000 copies per week in the United States, generating steady revenue for 4AD Records and the band members. In the streaming era, the album has found new audiences. Spotify reports that Doolittle tracks receive over 50 million streams annually, with Here Comes Your Man and Debaser each exceeding 100 million total streams. Younger listeners discovering the Pixies through algorithm recommendations often express shock that the album is from 1989. It sounds contemporary to ears raised on indie rock, garage rock revival, and post-punk revival. Music history is full of what-ifs, and Doolittle provides some of the most tantalizing. What if Francis had let Kim Deal write and sing more songs? Gigantic remains the Pixies' most beloved track, a song Deal co-wrote and sang. If Deal had contributed 3 or 4 more songs to Doolittle, would the album have been even more successful? Would the band have lasted longer? Or would more Deal-written material have undermined Francis's artistic vision, turning the album into a collection of songs rather than a cohesive statement? What if the Pixies had achieved massive commercial success in 1989 instead of watching Nirvana reap the benefits 2 years later? Would they have been crushed by mainstream expectations? Would Francis and Gil have been able to sustain the band through arena tours and MTV fame? Or would commercial success in 1989 have destroyed the Pixies the way it destroyed so many other underground bands who sold out? What if Steve Albini had produced Doolittle instead of Gil Norton? Would the album have been as influential without Norton's polish? Would it have reached as many listeners? Would Kurt Cobain have found the same inspiration in a rawer, more abrasive version of these songs? These questions can't be answered. But they highlight how precarious the album's success was. How many variables had to align perfectly for Doolittle to become what it became. The 2004-2013 reunion era proved both the enduring appeal of Doolittle and the impossibility of recapturing its magic. The reunion tours sold out worldwide. The 2009 Doolittle tour, where the band played the entire album in sequence every night, grossed over 10 million across Europe and North America. Fans who'd been teenagers when Nevermind came out brought their own teenage children to see the band that inspired Nirvana. 3 generations of alternative rock fans, from the original 4AD devotees to grunge kids to 2000s indie rock fans, filled venues from clubs to theaters to arenas. But the shows themselves were oddly joyless. Francis and Gil barely spoke on stage. There was no banter, no spontaneity, no sense that these 4 people enjoyed each other's company. They were professionals executing a job, playing the songs with precision but without passion. Joey Santiago addressed this in a 2012 interview. "We're older now. We're not angry kids anymore. We play the songs well, the fans are happy, we get paid. That's enough. We don't need to be best friends." When Gil finally left in 2013, the remaining members seemed almost relieved. The pretense of a band could be dropped. The Pixies became Black Francis's backing group, with hired musicians playing Gil's bass lines and vocal harmonies. Santiago confirmed there was no drama. "We said our goodbyes, and that's it." After 25 years of tension, the end was almost anticlimactic. Let's quantify the actual influence of Doolittle beyond critical acclaim. Kurt Cobain's admission that he ripped off the Pixies led directly to Nevermind, selling 10 million copies in the US alone. If we calculate even 10% of Nirvana's success as attributable to Pixies' influence, Doolittle indirectly generated over $50 million in record sales for the alternative rock movement. The album itself sold over 1.45 million copies worldwide. Modest by pop standards, but extraordinary for an underground rock album with minimal radio play. At least 50 major alternative rock bands have cited Doolittle as a primary influence, from Radiohead to Weezer to Modest Mouse to The Strokes. If we count the combined album sales of these influenced artists, we're talking about hundreds of millions of records sold using variations on the Pixies formula. The album has been covered, sampled, or referenced by hundreds of artists. In 2005, various indie rock bands recorded tribute album The Hell That Is Doolittle, covering every track. Film and television have licensed Doolittle tracks thousands of times. Here Comes Your Man alone has appeared in over 100 TV shows and films, generating substantial sync licensing revenue. The album helped establish 4AD Records as one of the most important independent labels in rock history. The commercial and critical success of Doolittle allowed 4AD to sign and develop dozens of other artists throughout the 1990s and 2000s. If there's one lesson from the Doolittle story, it's this. Great art often comes from people who barely tolerate each other. The Beatles made their best work while the Lennon-McCartney partnership was deteriorating. Fleetwood Mac recorded Rumors while the band was falling apart. The Eagles were at each other's throats throughout Hotel California. Creative tension isn't a bug. It's a feature. The Francis-Gil dynamic, antagonistic as it was, pushed both artists to their limits. Francis had to write songs so undeniably good that even Gil couldn't overshadow them. Gil had to be so effortlessly charismatic that even Francis couldn't ignore her. That competition, that mutual resentment mixed with grudging respect, created the electricity that made Doolittle special. When they reunited in 2004, the resentment remained, but the competition was gone. They were middle-aged professionals playing their greatest hits. Technically proficient but emotionally hollow. You can't fake the hunger that made Doolittle great. You can't manufacture the desperate need to prove yourself that drove Francis in 1988. You can't replicate the frustration Gil felt at being sidelined, the way that frustration made her bass playing sharp and her vocal harmonies cut like glass. So what is Doolittle? It's the album that proved aggressive music could have melody. It's the blueprint Kurt Cobain used to write Smells Like Teen Spirit. It's the sound of 4 incompatible people creating something none of them could have made alone. It's proof that production values and artistic integrity aren't mutually exclusive. It's the album that sold modestly in 1989 and influenced everything that came after. It's 38 minutes and 39 seconds of music that changed rock and roll forever. It's the peak of a band that couldn't sustain their own success. It's a platinum record that took 29 years to go platinum. It's Francis's surrealist vision filtered through Norton's commercial instincts, animated by Dill's charisma and Santiago's guitar genius and Lovering's metronomic precision. It's the album that inspired a generation of musicians who sold more records than the Pixies ever did. And 35 years later, it still sounds like nothing else. This has been the Sound Vault. Every album has a story. And Doolittle, despite all the tension, the lawsuits that never happened, the breakups and reunions and breakups again, remains one of rock and roll's most perfect imperfections. Four misfits from Boston made an album in 6 weeks that influenced 30 years of rock music. They barely spoke to each other by the time it was finished. They broke up 4 years later. And none of that matters when you press play and hear Black Francis scream, "Got me a movie!" while Joey Santiago's guitar slices through the speakers like a chainsaw through silk. That's Doolittle. That's the story. That's enough.